And we're going to hear today a whole new angle on the notion of what we think extraterrestrials, UFOs, and such things are about, and how this links to consciousness. So it's great to explore this from a new angle, and I'm sure we're going to have a great time. So please, a big hand for Anthony Beckett.
Thank you, Andy. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you all hear me? Oh, I can hear myself now, that's good. So yeah, thank you Andy for inviting me. And it's wonderful to be here in Glastonbury, which is a location that's well known for some mysterious phenomena that I'll be talking to you about today. Glastonbury Tor was once home to a fairy king, it's said, called Gwyn ap Nudd, who was the ruler of the other world, or Anwen, in Welsh mythology. A fairy king who was expelled from the Tor by a 7th century monk called St. Cullen. So Glastonbury indeed seems to be a special place and have much to offer in its history. And an aspect of this history involves the subject of my talk today, which is the manifestation of unidentified light forms and objects. On Midsummer's Day in 1981, the Tor was visited by a dragon. Witnesses to the phenomena described a dragon-shaped glowing orange light writhe out of the ruined church tower on the summit of the Tor. And they reported that the dragon seemed to earth itself near Chalice Well at the foot of the hill. So while reports of dragons appear to be extremely rare, other unusual phenomena have been observed over the Tor. Flying saucers have been seen, as have red balls of light and the more common orange ball of light. My personal interest in this phenomena comes from my living in a region of Yorkshire, where many of these mysterious phenomena have occurred throughout the recent history. And this photograph is from the Ministry of Defence's Project Condign report, and it's a photograph taken by police officer Tony Dodd on Carlton Moor, near where I live near Skipton. It's the transient nature of the UFO phenomenon that has meant almost all UFO studies have been limited to studying UFO reports and not to UFOs themselves. Indeed, all publicly available official studies in the US and the UK, from Project Sign to Project Condign, have failed to directly study UFO phenomena at all. So in this talk here today, I'm going to be looking at the limited number of published scientific studies that were set up to investigate and look at specifically UFO phenomena, investigating them directly in the field. And I'll follow this by briefly exploring UFO evidence within the confines of the paradigm of science, which simply ignores any notion of intelligence being behind a phenomena. In removing the notion of intelligent cause, arguments lose their dependency on this unprovable concept, and this allows us to come to a greater understanding of the UFO phenomena in its physical manifestation. Then, before we explore the idea of intelligence being behind the phenomena, we'll look at the boundary between these concepts as we look at intelligence as being both a supernatural and a natural phenomena. And in closing, I will look at the nature of the alien manifestation that jumps out from this approach. So looking at the phenomena in this way gives us perhaps a fresh perspective, but also a firmer foundation upon which we can hope to comprehend this and other mysteries that are not easily dealt with the quagmire and paradox that is ufology. So how this phenomena came to rise to the attention of officialdom is well known. However, it's worth quickly reviewing this to remind ourselves of the reported forms that people would report. The earliest officially documented reports of UFOs, or as the MOD calls them, unidentified aerial phenomena, are the air encounter reports reported by aircrew during the bombing raids over Germany and Japan in the Second World War, so in the latter years of World War II. These objects were usually solitary objects, sometimes seen in pairs, and they were balls of light, usually yellow to red, but the colours ranged across the visible spectrum. Seen as luminous and sometimes transparent, they were also reported to be sometimes metallic, and these light forms were often observed keeping pace with aircraft in positions just in front or behind the aircraft and just off the wingtips. So we know of these phenomena today as Foo Fighters. They're so named due to the eerie feeling that they gave the aircrew during the bombing raids over Germany. And these phenomena appear to be visually different to what were to follow in the USA. And Stanton Friedman and Don Blinner referred to them as proto-UFOs in their book Crash at Corona. The suggestion being that these were not UFOs, but there was some primitive precursor to the UFO phenomenon. So I'd just like to give my own definition of a proto-UFO for the purpose of this talk. So while proto means primitive or original, and a proto-UFO would be taken to mean a primitive or original form of object that would it develops into a manifestation that we know and recognize as a UFO. And this is limited to known physical phenomena. And if you need a definition of UFO or unidentified flying object, I'll simply define that as any object that can be excluded from any known class of object. Any object that can be excluded from any known class of object by its distinguishable nature that is observed in the air, upon the land, or in or upon a body of water. This photograph shows two flying discs witnessed by multiple observers in Pontiac, Michigan. And these are 2 or 3 discs seen by multiple observers, and they were described as being 2 feet in diameter and 2 to 4 inches thick. And they were seen sailing over Orchard Lake Country Club on July 7th of 1947. And this is clearly the form of UFO identified by the official US Air Force study, Project Sign. And it was Project Sign, and it's in the Project Sign report. It described these forms as flying discs or saucers, also described torpedo and cigar-shaped bodies, spherical and balloon-shaped objects, and of course balls of light. And the report described the motion as being capable of manoeuvring, climbing and travelling at high speed. Some Project Sign members have been in favour of the interplanetary explanation for the phenomena. However, the report itself simply indicated that other more likely solutions would be prioritised for investigation. And after the report was issued, the seemingly frankness of Project Sign gave way to the seemingly disingenuous Project Grudge, whose outlook more resembled that of a public relations exercise and, of course, Project Blue Book. And it was a US Air Force-funded study directed by Dr. Ed Condon at the University of Colorado that became a thorn in the side of serious research into UFOs, following Condon publishing his recommendations back in 1968. Condon was a no-nonsense physicist who was well respected within the scientific community. And in the Colorado study report, he wrote that our general conclusion is that nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration of the record, as it is available to us, leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified in the expectation that science will be advanced thereby. So although Condon had not said there was nothing to the UFO phenomenon, it only said that the study had not contributed to a body of knowledge, as it was in 1947. This recommendation was used to shut down UFO reporting by the US Air Force. And later in the report, though, he stated that the report's recommendation against further research may not be true for all time. It was simply the case that, according to Condon, it was continuing to expend resources was unlikely to yield anything else, and so was likely unjustified. It is worth remembering, however, that the study was only able to study UFOs by studying UFO reports and not UFOs themselves. The study did have provision for field investigations. However, this proved not to be effective because field investigators would always arrive too late to make any evaluation in the field. In a critique by one scientist, the study failed because the administrators did not recognise the need for observation stations in the field. British physicist Peter Sturrock of Stanford University had been highly critical of Condon's conclusions and the methodological mistakes made in the study design. It was Sturrock's position that the definitive resolution of the UFO enigma will not come about unless the problem is subjected to open and extensive scientific study by the normal procedures established by science and by administrators in universities. So before we begin to look at the scientific studies of UFOs, it's worthwhile revisiting attempts to classify UFO phenomena, as discerned from UFO reports. These were made in an attempt to identify common traits between UFO sightings based on the physical characteristics of the perceived UFO and the environmental conditions and other circumstances under which the sighting was made. And the aim was to organise a body of data so that the relationships between the phenomena could be examined in the hope of elucidating something out of UFO reports. So astronomer and Project Blue Book consultant Dr. Jalen Hynek came up with this now famous classification system, which describes UFO reports as nocturnal lights, daylight discs, radar visual cases, and these relate to objects observed at a distance. The next three, made famous by Steven Spielberg, are close encounters of the first, second, and third kind. The first being a sighting within 500 feet, the second adding that the object affected the environment in some manner, and a third adding that there was reporting of occupants or entities associated with the object. Jacques Vallée came up with the most comprehensive UFO classification system for UFO reporting studies. His original system dealt with a detailed set of circumstances under which an object was seen, and included its appearance and motion. He later attempted to unify this into Hynek's system, while also aiming to provision it for more generous anomalous phenomena that Vallée came to believe were broadly associated with the UFO phenomena. And we'll look at this again later. There are only a handful of published studies of scientific field investigations into UFO phenomena, and the earliest report attempt could arguably be the US Geological Survey's attempt to study the Brown Mountain Lights in North Carolina in 1913. However, the first significant attempt to monitor them was Project Starlight International, which was founded by ufologist Ray Stanford in 1964. Other studies have been conducted, notably one by Canadian geophysicist Wilbert B. Smith. However, caveat and conclusion here is that the study has been published publicly. Since we cannot learn much from unknown unknowns or known unknowns, such as the conclusions in reports we're not privy to, let alone aware of, this is really the only viable data set we can use. So in 1973, 4 years after the Condon study recommendations began the demise of the respectability of ufology, the small town of Piedmont, Missouri became a focal point for research when a UFO flap began in the area. From February of that year, Piedmont police would receive about 500 UFO reports on the outlying region in the Ozark Mountains. And one of the most well-known cases reported is that of basketball case Reggie Bone, who, while travelling home from a game with players and team managers, reportedly witnessed the following. We saw a bright shaft of light beaming down out of the sky. It looked like it was about 200 yards off the road, hovering over an open field. It was impossible to determine the size or shape because of the darkness. Anyway, we saw 4 lights that looked like portholes, red, green, amber, and white. We figured they were about 3 or 4 feet apart, all in a row. In the nearby city of Cape Girardeau, Missouri, professor and chair of the University of Missouri's physics department, Dr. Harley D. Rutledge, began hearing the stories, not just from the national news media, but also from students at the university. It seemed as if the majority of people in Piedmont had seen something, mostly unexplained lights. 2 students visited Rutledge one day and told him they'd seen a flying saucer in the region. Skeptical yet curious, Rutledge decided to go out into the field with a colleague and investigate the phenomenon for himself, and him and his colleague witnessed some orange balls of light for themselves. And this was enough for Rutledge to seek to undertake a full scientific field study. And using his university's equipment, resources, and volunteers, they set about to achieve the following objectives, which were to measure the physical properties of the lights or objects in the sky, and to identify their origin. The initial 2-week study in Piedmont was extended to a wider region when they returned to Cape Girardeau and found that Cape Girardeau was experiencing a UFO flap of its own. And during the study, multiple teams would communicate by CB radio and were able to observe lights and objects from different vantage points, allowing observations to be made at the same moment in time. They used cameras with diffraction grating to analyze light spectra, radar equipment to measure electromagnetic effects, and also radar receivers as well. And the 8-year study saw over 400 hours of observations being made, in which they recorded 45 UFOs and a remainder of about 170 sightings that had not been eliminated as being known phenomena. So of these UFO phenomena, they recorded orange balls of light that would appear and switch on for a few seconds and then switch off. Then a few moments later, the orange ball of light would switch on in a different location. This would happen multiple times, with the object sometimes returning to the starting point. Rutledge also recorded a phenomenon he termed the random flashbulb effect. This was a series of outwardly random xenon-like lights that would flash on and disappear, and xenon has a characteristic blue or lavender-coloured glow. This effect would last for a few seconds, after which an off-white light would appear amidst the random flashing and slowly move away from the flashing region. Also, objects seen by naked eye or observed by telescope to be a single light source would inexplicably show up as multiple light sources in long-exposure photographs. So while camera shake was inevitable, it couldn't account for the patterns observed in the photographs. And test shots using non-light sources, such as the moon and electrical lighting, gave different patterns of results. Multiple light trails for a singular identified object could not be explained by the team. Observation of the night sky would also reveal what the team calls pseudo-stars, stationary lights camouflaged by known constellation stars that would suddenly, inexplicably move, sometimes appearing to react to the actions of an observer. And also, they have mimicry. Some light objects were seen to mimic the appearance of known objects. While in the Piedmont area, they witnessed triangular formations of red lights, which appeared to make sounds like engine noise. And initially, the team didn't even report these as UFO sightings because they simply assumed that they were aircraft. Only later did they realize that these things weren't aircraft. Also, another interesting case of UFO mimicry, Dr. Rutledge, while he was on his doorstep back in Cape Girardeau, witnessed what he perceived as being a jet approaching a UFO. And on a recent Skywatch, they'd actually seen jets appearing to intercept UFOs. However, when he looked at the object through binoculars, the airplane didn't look like an airplane at all. It had a serrated effect on the straight wings, and Rutledge concluded that this was simply a form of UFO and not an aircraft. And they would also report pseudo-satellites, light objects that were seemingly indistinguishable from satellites, apart from that would make sharp right-angle turns in apparent violation of the laws of physics. The results of the study showed that the peak time for UFO sightings was 8:30 p.m., the average time, However, Rutledge could discover that the variability of peak time throughout the year was the change in sunset time. The peak was in fact dusk. They recorded numerous shapes of UFOs, including triangles with red lights, bullet-shaped metallic objects, and semi-convex disks. And yet the team had also noticed some very unusual observer effects and some strange coincidences that appeared to be connected with the light object behavior. The team had noticed that when observing a light object, a change of speed or direction would sometimes seemingly coincide with an action or a decision taken by the observer. For example, after watching an object for a while, an observer would raise a camera to take a photograph of it, and the object would either just disappear or blink out. And Rutledge also realized that the coincidence of his own personal sightings of UFOs, particularly his daylight sightings, were such, because the sightings were such short duration, the coincidence was such that it indicated to him that these things were being presented to him as staged events. It was almost like the objects wanted to be seen. And this apparent coincidence with object-like behavior being associated with observer acts accounted for about 80 recorded events throughout the study. And Rutledge concluded that the possibility that meaningful coincidences were part of an intelligence-driven experience. Possibly a great deal of UFO activity is subliminal, which, if true, could have serious ramifications. So he wrote in his book, Project Identification. Astronomer and Project Blue Book consultant Dr. J.L. Hynek visited Piedmont, Missouri towards the end of March of 1973, invited by State Representative Jerry Howard at the request of the local police chief. Hynek, however, was reportedly unimpressed with the actual UFO reports coming out of Piedmont at the time, stating flatly that they'd all found some very uninteresting stuff and a great number of highly excited people. Over a decade later, in another region of high UFO activity, this time in Norway's sparsely populated Hessdalen Valley, Hynek would find a convergence of a high intensity of sightings on a tiny population that would find much more interesting. The Hessdalen Valley has become famous for its unusual and yet frequent manifestations of balls of light and other UFOs, including cigar-shaped and bullet-shaped metallic objects. And this phenomenon first began being reported in Hessdalen in the 1940s during the post-war ghost rocket era. However, a significant increase in reports occurred during the 1980s, and at the peak of activity in 1984, the sightings of balls of light were reported between 14 and 20 times per week. Journalist and photographer Arne Wist visited Hessdalen in February of 1982 to cover the UFO sightings in the region. And he'd apparently been skeptical and had expected to write a debunking piece until he witnessed the phenomena for himself. A star came towards us, and near the top of Rahovde Mountain, with a tremendous speed, the star was no longer a star, but an intense growing light source. Above the mountaintop, it suddenly stopped, then it sunk down along the top. I fetched my camera with a 600mm telescopic lens to take a picture. The sight in the viewfinder was impressive. It was great. It was oval. It came just moving. Then it stopped short again. I had a strange feeling. It has caught sight of us. I pushed the releaser, and suddenly the object was gone. It was like someone pulling down a curtain. Studies into the Hessdalen lights were instigated by two Swedish and Norwegian UFO organizations in 1984 and 1995, with the Project Hessdalen research supported by the University of Oslo, the University of Bergen, and also the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment through the loan of equipment. And the team had installed equipment similar to Rutledge's study in Missouri. They'd installed radio receivers, low-frequency cameras and radar equipment, and in the first month, 53 observations of UFOs were made. Hessdalen is really a UFO laboratory. It's a place where things are happening and things can be studied, the words of J.L. Hynek. That's Hynek in the movie 2001. Sorry, Close Encounters, sorry. So Hessdalen had afforded a unique opportunity to study what were usually rare phenomena. During the 1990s, Italian scientists who had been working at SETI came across the previously published Project Hessdalen studies, and they travelled to Hessdalen themselves to study the phenomena for themselves. They started to set up automatic measurement stations to gather radar data and electromagnetic data, which will be sent back to Bologna for later analysis. And this allowed unmanned monitoring and also complemented manned field studies where visual observations and photography would occur simultaneously. It was run by the Radio Astronomy Centre in Bologna, Italy, and the study was called the EMBLA project. And the name is reference to ensemble-based data assimilation, which is a methodology used in the forecasting of atmospheric and oceanic phenomena because it's suited to transient phenomena. The scientific study today has studied the more common light bulb phenomena such as shown in this photograph. The coloured lines beneath the light sources are from the diffraction grating, and these are used to determine the wavelength of electromagnetic radiation that makes up the observed light. And in the published scientific data, they report that objects appear as physical matter, not illusory or simply light phenomena. Objects have been observed to range in size from a few inches to up to 30 feet in diameter, and they've been recorded travelling up to 30 kilometres per hour. Colours of balls of light include red, green and blue, and these often show up as white from the 3 distinct colour bands. Blue and red orbs have also been observed to exist together in close proximity, and they're able to form new orbs close by. And this is considered strange because the energy requirement for blue plasmas is different to that of red plasmas, so they would not be expected to form if these were just normal plasmas. And these two plots show light intensity distribution in the case of a typical plasma on the left and a typical Hessdalen phenomenon on the right. The vertical axis is the light intensity and the other dimensions of the area of the photograph or the image. And this shows that Hessdalen lights are not typical plasmas, and according to the published paper, they are in fact features that would be expected for a solid object. Hessdalen phenomena have also been observed to precipitate metal fragments. Pieces of metal have been collected that the scientists believed had been dropped by the balls of light. And this is an image of a metal particle believed to be produced by the phenomena. However, scientists say this is still to be confirmed. The spherical particle in this case is only about 15 microns across. So in addition to the basic ball of light phenomena, they've discovered that the objects can appear as luminous objects of basic symmetrical shapes. So these two, for example, have bilateral symmetry in these top two, and these are rectilinear shapes in these two images here. In the year 2000, the Ian Billet project had multiple teams of observers in various viewing stations, and they recorded the following diversity of phenomena. They recorded strong, irregularly pulsating white lights, faint, regularly pulsating light showing colour changement, point light flashes, diffuse flashes in the sky, and 3 co-moving red lights that they termed the triangle, and also a small stationary light in the wood. A town meeting was set up where, without being told the results that the scientists have discovered, the local people were asked to relay their own experiences, while the scientists simply listened. In the preliminary report of the phenomena, the lead scientist made the following observation. It must be recognised that the extraordinary match between the sightings made by the EMBLA team and the ones reported over and over again by the Hessdalen inhabitants plays in favour of the existence of the visual phenomena in a bimodal form, with which it has been reported since at least 20 years. Without any sort of doubt, unstructured and plasma-like lights coexist with structured objects for a reason that it's not possible to explain. Temporal statistics for Hessdalen show that the phenomena is more common just after midnight, with a minor peak at 7:30 p.m. I'm actually unaware of the actual, whether they've made a correlation between sunset and dawn and dusk. So we can't actually compare this to Rutledge's study in Missouri. However, it's also interesting to note that Rutledge's study always finished before midnight, so we've got no way data to compare the peak of just after midnight. The scientific studies, particularly this Hessdalen study, have been successful in part due to the ability to monitor specific areas for extended periods with fully automated measurement stations. And recent studies show that Hessdalen phenomena radiate strongly in the ultraviolet band, which is in common with the reports in ufology where witnesses have been known to suffer from conjunctivitis, for example, as a result of UV exposure. So, the Hessdalen phenomenon, it's real, so what causes it? Various scientific explanations have been put forward. Some think it may be a combustion process whereby clouds of dust from the valley floor containing scandium combust in the air. Another idea is that macroscopic Coulomb crystals are formed in plasma created by radioactive radon gas ionizing air and dust. And another idea is that piezoelectricity-produced plasmas have been suggested where they're generated by certain crystalline rocks under specific stresses, and these are commonly known as earth lights and created from crystals like quartz. It's also been suggested by the scientists involved in Project Hessdalen that the phenomena may result from the spontaneous release of natural zero-point energy, the quantum fluctuations of vacuum state. And in the words of key Project Hessdalen members in a paper published in 2001, we are facing a source of energy of tremendous power which, if definitively understood, could be reproduced in a laboratory and subsequently bridled for our technological necessities. So if ever you needed a reason for a cover-up, there we have one. The aforementioned explanations of Hessdalen phenomena do have one thing in common. These are all natural causes. And one reason for this is that science essentially adheres to the rule of methodological naturalism, which stipulates that only natural processes can be invoked in scientific statements. So is this just a natural process? Is there any evidence of of an intelligent process at work? Indeed, to date, there appears to be no published scientific data that shows intelligence being behind the phenomena. However, given the philosophical framework that science uses, we would expect any discussion to that end to be outside of the scientific papers. This photograph shows original Hessdalen researcher Erling Strand and Leif Havik with Dr. Jelen Heineck during his time there 30 years ago. Both Strand and Havik claim to have witnessed light phenomena interacting with witnesses. Erling Strand is now an assistant professor at Østfold University College, and today is the leader of the Project Hessdalen. And according to the 14 Times, several of the original Project Hessdalen people, including Erling Strand, have quietly admitted that in about 10% of their observations, they felt that the lights were interacted with them. If such reports have any credence, then some UAPs, which is the MOD's term for UFOs, some UAPs may possess rudimentary intelligence, often displayed as playful, animal-like curiosity. In his book, Earth-like Revelations, Paul Devereux tells us that Strand told him that he would eventually avoid taking his camera with him into the field. Strand had realised that he's more likely to see this mystery-like phenomena if he left his camera at home. There was some kind of consciousness effect going on, and like Dr. Harley D. Rutledge before him, Strand had come to realise the very subtle effects that this phenomenon seems to possess. So the scientists involved in this research acknowledge that there's a lot that's not understood about the Hessdalen phenomenon, not least what causes it. And outside of research papers, they do actually, in fact, make connections to UFO report studies. So with partially understood phenomena such as these, are these phenomena proto-UFOs? Are these the vehicles, or rather agents, choosing my words more wisely, for the manifestation of an object called a UFO? So beyond being simply a physical phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon has been shown to interact with witnesses at a profound level, as we've seen with Project Hessdalen and Project Identification. And Paul Devereux, taking this concept further, suggests that not only can the UFO phenomenon affect the consciousness of the observer, but he argues that the individual experiencer may directly influence the phenomenon itself through their own consciousness, resulting in noticeable changes in some forms that UFO phenomena take. So consciousness is clearly an important area of UFO research, and it would be futile to attempt to look at this subject without looking at least the possibilities of consciousness and giving it at least a cursory investigation. It is thus with regard to the disease called sacred. It appears to me no wise more divine, no more sacred than other diseases, but it has a cause, a natural cause from which it originates like other affections. Men regard its nature and cause as divine from ignorance and wonder, because it is not at all like other diseases. And this notion of its divinity is kept up by their inability to comprehend it. So here, Hippocrates, who was a Greek physician who was considered the father of Western medicine, shows us that there's no misgivings around certain states of mind being rooted in the physical. And temporal lobe epilepsy that is referring to here has been offered as a diagnosis for such human experiences as UFO abductions and spiritual possession. However, at what point have we proven that a diagnosis of a pathology, such as simple temporal lobe epilepsy, isn't simply a physical symptom with an external, intelligent cause? The aforementioned rule of methodological naturalism clearly shows how science, when performed in its strictest sense, cannot deal with consciousness as an attribute of an intelligent mind. This is simply beyond the scope of science. What science can and has demonstrated are the physical and outwardly unintelligent microprocesses that it would seem are part of what the intelligent mind is composed of. So leaving ancient Greece for contemporary Sudbury, Ontario, we find a controversial professor and the founder of the field of neurotheology. Dr. Michael Persinger has been engaged in scientific UFO research since the 1960s. First, though, we will look at his work on the so-called God experience. In the laboratory, we have reproduced every aspect of the God experience, every essence, every component of it, from the rising sensation to the feelings of ecstasy, to the feelings of a sense presence, to the feelings that you are at one with the universe. We can do that experimentally. Persinger specifically claimed that this work can reproduce all the major components of the near-death experience. However, it's claimed by Chris Carter, author of Science and the Near-Death Experience, that Persinger's claims appear in retrospect to have been hyperbole. If we look more closely, we find that the experiments produce key properties of near-death experiences. However, even Persinger, perhaps more humbly, states that these induced experiences are fragmented and variable, whereas near-death experiences, they are integrated and focused within a brief period. So perhaps analogous to the Miller-Urey experiment, which attempts to recreate the chemicals of life in the laboratory, the basic ingredients can be generated. However, the complexity of the whole phenomena are not themselves created. So this does not necessarily negate the importance of the work, but it perhaps simply relegates it to a set of mechanisms through which a phenomenon manifests. So what does this have to do with UFOs? In a 1983 paper entitled Expected Clinical Consequences of Close Proximity to UFO-Related Luminosities, Persinger considered the effect that a UFO would have on the human being. And in it, the author states that as an observer approached the luminosity, or as it approached the observer, the more intense current induction with the observer from the time-varying magnetic fields by the luminosity would begin to alter brain function. He suggests that the stimulation of the temporal lobe structures would modify consciousness, perceptual processing, and memory. At critical threshold values, depending on the characteristics of the induced current, electroconvulsive intensities would be achieved, and the observer would seizure and become unconscious. Perceptual experiences would be more vivid equivalents of the images generated by local electrical seizures with temporal lobe epilepsy, or generated by direct surgical stimulation of the temporal lobe structures. So in the diagram on the left here, in the diagram on the left here, I think it shows the differences as the distance between the source of the luminosity and the human being changes. So a large distance, the observer sees just the odd ball of light. The closer in, they start to see more physical detail. But then it gets to the point where the magnetic field begins to affect the body and eventually begins to affect the brain. And also a point could be reached where death can be, a UFO fatality could occur through the energies involved. So as I'm sure you'll appreciate, here we're getting into some tough questions. However, looking at this through the lens of science allows us not to worry about intelligent cause. And the rule of methodological naturalism comes to our aid. Here we can see the correlation between Persinger's chart that we've just seen and Jacques Vallée's UFO classification system that we saw previously. In Vallée's chart, moving from left, we have a close encounter of the first kind, or a luminosity, of a UFO or luminosity, and this equates to Persinger's odd ball of light. So as we move up Persinger's chart and the magnetic field strength increases, we're also moving right across Vallée's chart. Injury and death from a UFO luminosity is easy to understand given the perceived energies involved. However, the subtle effects that Vallée termed reality transformation are less easy to understand, less easy to see. Could magnetic field induction of the brain function account for the altered states of consciousness and memory loss described in close encounters? Could it account for the eerie feelings that people sometimes report? Are the living entities witnessed solely due to induced field effects on the brain, perhaps as a simple function of magnetic field strength? Dr. Kenneth Ring was a professor of psychology who'd been researching near-death experiences for several years. One day he received a pre-publication copy of Whitley Strieber's book Communion from the publisher. Although he'd not been interested in UFOs, Ring soon became intrigued after realizing the UFO experience, as described by Strieber, was very similar to the near-death experiences that he'd seen in his own studies. He undertook a clinical study with abductees that led to his 1992 book, The Omega Project, and in it, Ring argues that these two types of experiences are related due to the shared characteristics of the two groups. And he goes on to argue that both near-death experiences and the UFO experience are essentially two variants of a more fundamental phenomenon. The similarities include the role that environmental crises play within the experience, and also the life-changing qualities that the experience brings about. And Ring argued that these two experiences are moving the human species towards another level of consciousness. A Lancashire family's encounter with the UFO shows another often overlooked aspect to the UFO experience. Rachel Devereux, her mother Anne, and Rachel's two sons had been travelling home. Having left the A65 near Ingleton in North Yorkshire, they were near the town of Bentham when a bright light suddenly appeared before them. The light they described as compelling and soothing, and they described that it washed over them, inducing feelings of love. All the family members said that they wished to go away with the light, and they all experienced intense grief and loss as it disappeared. They also realised that the car journey that should have taken 20 minutes had taken an hour and 20 minutes. The producers of a Sky TV documentary called The Real 4400 arranged for Rachel to undergo hypnotic regression, in which she recounted what happened to her family. And she described the bright light, short beings that floated around her, and she heard her sons laughing and she felt fear for her sons, but she heard a voice in her head reassuringly telling her that they were in no danger. Hypnotist Steve Burgess felt that what she'd recalled were actual memories of actual events. And while recounting her experiences, both Rachel and Anne had been moved to tears. Love, light, and the feeling of oneness is part of a class of religious experience that's related to unusual light forms, as documented by the Religious Experiences Research Unit, which is an organisation founded by Sir Leicester Hardy at Manchester College at the University of Oxford in 1969. It's now based out of the University of Wales Trinity St David, and the archive contains 6,000 accounts of religious experiences, of which 400 involve light. Now, these experiences, in these experiences, sometimes the light is a light form manifests from within, but often the light forms are experienced in the landscape, light forms from without. And these are documented in a book called Spiritual Encounters with Unusual Light Phenomena, Light Forms by Dr. Mark Fox. In one example case, the bereaved husband reported to the unit that 25 days following the death of his wife, he twice heard a male voice, followed by a voice of his wife, say, "Take me to see him now." Just over a month later, in February of 1964, the man experienced multiple lights in his home. Early in February of 1964, strange lights began to appear in all parts of the room where I happened to be. Beautiful pale blue, slowly fading in, staying for a few seconds, and then slowly fading out. They were at their best in a darkened room while I was by myself thinking of her. Sometimes they came singly, very bright and large, and sometimes numerous and small. In about the middle of February, just before settling down for the night, the lights were extra numerous, 15 or 20, but more numerous than previously. While contemplating them and wondering as to their significance, a different light appeared, more like a flame of light, about as large as my hands, golden flame colour high up in the room, approximately 10 feet away. And this startled me and brought an exclamation to my lips, unfortunately so, as the flame light immediately vanished and has never returned. The husband went on to point out that, incidentally, I'm acutely deaf and cannot hear a conversation. However, there's no difficulty in hearing the voices. So this testimony that describes light forms external to the experiencer is, while more dramatic than most, is similar to other experiences with light forms, particularly those that happen at a time of crisis in people's lives. And we can see a number of correlations here with the UFO experience. Obviously, the appearance of unexplained lights. The distinction between these lights and UFO sightings is simply the superficial distinction of the size of the object and the location, often being indoors. And superficially, they do seem to be comparable to Dr. Rutledge's lights appearing on the landscape and disappearing after a few seconds and redisappearing periodically. Also particularly noteworthy are the apparent consciousness effects, where the light seemingly responds to thoughts or actions of an observer. And in this case, given that the man was acutely deaf, it's also probably appropriate to consider other mechanisms for the rendering of voices consciously, such as through stimulation of the observer's auditory processes or perhaps via temporal lobe effects. And this shows us that light phenomena experienced in the realm of spiritual encounters and that of the outdoors UFO experience may not be quite as separate as many of us first assume. A number of commentators, including Nick Pope, have suggested that the concept of a flying saucer perceived as spaceships is a modern phenomenon. Don Cupit suggests that only after human beings had begun to think of building spaceships does the human religious experience begin to include apparitions of flying saucers. However, Pierre Sabac points out that far from being a modern construct, the notion that the circular ones, the ophonym, are flying saucers, referenced in the biblical and apocryphal sources, in which they're described as being angelic ships and thus celestial vessels, indicating that the notion of a spaceship is not new. So what Sabac is referring to here is the consideration that ufologists have simply been reinventing the wheels in the modern age. And the wheels are an angelic order referenced as the ophonym, and as Sabac argues, there is a clear correlation between them and UFOs and aliens in contemporary ufology. And indeed, the influence of this appears to underlie virtually all religions and cultures and can be seen in our own culture, British culture, with its heraldry and structures of government. So with regards to the idea that the religious experience only began to include the apparitions of flying saucers, only after people began to conceive of spaceships, what the criticism is reaching at is the idea that people are these are coming from a preconceived notion, which is a process called constructivism. It's also claimed, however, that experiences with light forms, at least in the confines of the religious experience, are at least driven by experiences' prior expectation. It is often commented on the relevant literature that visions correspond to prior expectation, leading to the conclusion that somehow experience, cultural, linguistic repertoires of beliefs, concepts and values somehow cause the experiences they have, shaping them to conform to these expectations. That's quoting Dr. Mark Fox from the Spiritual Encounters with Light Forms book. An example of this would be the consistent descriptions of visions of the Virgin Mary across cultures. The studies of the UFO phenomena shows that the light forms do exist in a physical, measurable state, a light form from without. So what do these great expectations mean for these clearly non-visionary light phenomena, UFOs? So in reference to a shared experience with a UFO that morphed into a human-like form, reminiscent to Paul Devereux as Michelangelo's Vitruvian Man, he tells us the following. It was this experience that convinced me that the energy comprising Earthlights can be sensitive to the input of consciousness. What I saw was not a spacecraft, but it did display intelligence in the form of a visually transmitted concept. My own personal experience, I've witnessed firsthand these superficially perplexing coincidences of UFOs displaying symbolism relevant to thoughts and spoken words. Well, on a Skywatch recently with my friend David Griffin on the Yorkshire Moor, among the dozen or so Earth-like UFOs we saw, we had noted 2 counts of a UFO's changing behaviour and coincidences were our own spoken words. And you can read about this in my recent article in UFO Truth magazine called Pennine Illuminations. So this contact with light forms is a truly fascinating area. However, human beings have also recorded experiences with light from within, emanating from the human being. And it's such an experience that anthropologist Rasmussen describes when relaying the process by which Eskimo shamans receive their clairvoyant powers. Quamanek is a mysterious light which the shaman suddenly feels in his body, inside his head, within the brain, an inexplicable searchlight, a luminous fire, which enables him to see in the dark, both literally and metaphorically speaking, for he can now, even with eyes closed, see through darkness and perceive things, coming events which are hidden from others. Thus, he can now look into the future and into the secrets of others. Professor Persinger claims that people experiencing shamanic process, whether through the use of psychotropic drugs, shamanic practice, or even magnetic field induction of the human brain, all function through temporal lobe effects. And in a lecture entitled No More Secrets, Persinger claims to have demonstrated that people in this state have access to a collective knowledge through what he calls consciousness coherence with other human beings. And it's a process he argues is facilitated by the Earth's magnetic field. While studying remote viewers, such as Ingo Swann, they found that a remote viewer would achieve a greater accuracy when the Earth's magnetic field strength was lower. In other work, Persinger has also discovered that biophotons are emitted from the temporal lobe. The level of illumination is weak. It's reportedly about 1 in 10,000th that of starlight seen through a cloudy sky, but the effect is evidently real. And photons are quantized packets of light, meaning they are produced in discrete units rather than being continuous. And biophotons may, therefore, allow connection through consciousness, through interactions located in the temporal lobe, enabling, conceptually at least, the possibility that the human brain can utilize quantum entanglement, a property that Einstein called spooky action at a distance. So here we have the proverbial cat-in-a-box saga. We've got the superposition of quantum states capable of information transfer over unlimited distance. Is it possible that this is a process by which other intelligences could communicate with us over otherwise insurmountable distances? Others have also considered that the brain may even function as a quantum computer, utilizing quantum effects in other ways. So could these non-local properties of the brain be the gateway to the cosmos? Is it possible that coherence and information transfer between life forms is not limited to their presence being on the planet Earth and its magnetic field, but that this ability transcends its biosphere? So this brings us to the early days of ufology and the unearthly encounters with space brothers. Is it possible that these tales were founded in truth? Is it possible that these claims of the many 1940s and 50s and later contactees were contact with an alien intelligence in a process initiated by exposure to apparently natural terrestrial proto-UFOs? On the left here, we have George King, the odd one out here because King never claimed actual physical contact. Next to him is the controversial Billy Mayer. The controversy, did he or did he not fake the photographs? And obviously the same arguments made of George Adamski and others. And one can perhaps see how real contact with the unknown could lead an UFO experiencer to fabricate aspects of a tale to make it more palatable, more believable for others. However, is it possible that these partially understood proto-UFOs are indeed the precursors to these structured craft that are prescribed in the contactee literature? I'll leave you to make your own judgments up about that aspect of ufology. To me, the UFO photographs can be dubious, not simply because we have no way to know the provenance of a photograph, really. And I'm particularly intrigued, actually, by John Keel's remark to the effect that UFOs may not be very photogenic. Perhaps this cloud-like condensate that police officer Tony Dodd photographed in Adigan, West Yorkshire, all those years ago, is really how flying saucers become manifest. And this is more consistent with what we've come to understand about UFO phenomena from the scientific field studies. And it's also got its parallel in angelic manifestation, such as with the Nubagina, who are known to be the offspring of the clouds. So the first image, this is from Tony Dodd's Alien Investigator book from 1999. And the first image says it shows a UFO with a vapor trail and 3 glowing spheres. And the later image, taken afterwards, shows the true shape of the UFO after the vapor has been removed, and described that as being an orb on top, next to the flying saucer. So it's this etheric quality of the UFO experience that has long been recognized as a source of frustration for nuts and bolts ufologists whose acceptance criteria for belief it requires that they can kick the tires of the vehicle or the agent of the alien manifestation. Of the early UFO contactees, one particularly interesting case to me is that of Howard Menger. From childhood, Menger and his brother would tell of seeing flying saucers, and Howard would tell of his conversations with extraterrestrials in the mountainous terrain near his home. And as an adult, on many occasions, Menger his experiences would be corroborated by other people, friends and acquaintances. And those associates would describe seeing UFOs, specifically plasma-like lights, interacting with Menger while they're viewed from a short distance away. However, Menger himself would describe interacting with spacecraft and occupants. After one such visit to a particular place in the mountains near his home, Menger told his friends that his extraterrestrial contact felt that the group could be trusted and that she would make an appearance at the farmhouse where they were staying. According to Menger's witnesses, they went outside with him and looked away into the distance, and over a field in a wood, they saw light coming down through the trees. An apparition then moved across the field, through a fence, and had stopped at a distance, such a distance that a vaguely human outline could be seen. However, Howard's friends claimed to have seen the apparition, but couldn't tell if it was a real physical entity. It was too far away. So perhaps these forms that these apparent entities take is how they actually are. This is a photograph claimed by Howard Menger to be a real photograph of an extraterrestrial. So perhaps these forms that these apparent entities take are actually how they are, or maybe they're an approximation of how they are, possibly portrayed as a projection or an avatar. One might even suggest that these avatars might be constructed of proto-UFO matter, of plasmas. And if you add to this the concept that human consciousness can directly impact on proto-UFOs, such as Earthlights, could this simply be explained as an external projection from the human experience's consciousness? And even if that was the case that an apparition is driven by the human experiencer, does that really discount the possibility that the experience is caused by consciousness contact with an alien intelligence? In his work, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns and Fairies, Robert Kirk, who is a 17th century Gaelic speaker and minister to a remote Scottish remote Highland parish, documents for us the traditional beliefs of his parishioners that relate to the mysterious entities that Kirk termed the subterraneans. We find that Kirk's descriptions of fairies follows the same trend we've seen for cloud-like changeable forms. And of the subterraneans, he describes the nature of being of middle nature betwixt man and angel, of intelligent, studious spirits, and light, changeable bodies, somewhat of the nature of a condensed cloud, best seen in twilight. Some have bodies or vehicles so sponges thin and defecate, of congealed air, chameleon-like bodies that swim in the air. Tales reported by parishioners also suggest that Kirk himself may have had an experience on a fairy mound. He sunk down in a fit of apoplexy, which the unenlightened took for death, while the more understanding knew it to be a swoon produced by the supernatural influence of the people whose precincts he had violated. This can be found in his book, the 2007 version of this book, Secret Commonwealth. So to say we know very little about our own consciousness is a gross understatement. In the view of the new wave of academic interest into consciousness that looks beyond the basic mechanics, the fundamental aspects of it, the functional aspects of it, I should say, there's a growing realization that decades from now, Western science will cease standing alone from the older philosophical views of the nature of consciousness, a view that could embrace consciousness with the same regard that science holds for notions of space, time, mass, and electrical charge. In the words of Adrian Nelson, just as mass and charge are fundamental properties making up the observed world, might awareness in some unrefined proto-form be similarly fundamental. Among thinkers in academia today, there is a growing sense that we have anthropomorphized consciousness and that its origins lie not in us but in a deeper aspect of the world. So from this perspective, the concept of conscious entities interacting with each other using innate consciousness is not unexpected, and in fact, if the academic search for extraterrestrial intelligence was to embrace this view, surely it would seek to investigate the possibilities of consciousness contact of the potential extraterrestrials in the myriad of newly discovered worlds. The possibilities that the UFO phenomena can be explained as visitation by simply interplanetary spacecraft has been scoffed at by some researchers who recognize the inexplicable experiences that are often described in UFO lore. From the inexplicable manifestations such as the Hopkinsville goblins to the Voronezh robots and the silver-suited spaceman of Pembrokeshire, all these point towards something much more profound than simple visitation by interstellar spacecraft. And it's these edge cases in ufology that involve such bizarre and unusual aspects that encourage us to look for different answers than the notion of simple visitation by aliens. In the view of consciousness even the view of consciousness communication and manifestation by extraterrestrials, perhaps we are still adding an anthropomorphic bias. What these experiences do tell us is that we, the human experiences, are on occasion being deceived, but deceived by what? Are we being presented with the forms that we can simply relate to? Are alien intelligences anthropomorphizing UFO phenomena for us? UFO experiencer Emily Trim, who was among the 60 or so children who witnessed a landed UFO and aliens at aerial school in Zimbabwe in the early 1990s, she has suggested that this is the case. And also, when describing voyages high above the Earth and journeys to the Moon with alien intelligences, the Eskimo shamans were not very different to the UFO contactees, such as Howard Menger, who, unlike the shamans, claimed to have taken photographs on their trip. So the conclusions I've presented here so far have been based on the direct studies of UFO phenomena, and the scientific data shows that the predominant plasma form that the phenomena takes. And within these studies, both visual observation and consciousness effects parallel those found in what's considered spiritual and religious experiences with light forms. The question of whether these plasma forms are simply precursors to a higher form of manifestation of objects has been considered and actually remains open. However, the possibility that these objects described in UFO experience is caused by temporal lobe epilepsy, or temporal lobe transience as it's known. This is ruled out for forms such as flying saucers and triangles and other shapes other simple geometrical shapes of UFO phenomena. However, whether or not the higher complexity and detail in witnesses in UFO reports is caused solely by induced temporal lobe epilepsy, this cannot actually be ruled out. However, neither can we rule out the possibility that this experience within the reality transformation phase, as Vallée puts it, is actually being driven by an external intelligence. The correlation between spiritual experiences with light forms and the UFO phenomena does that perhaps allow us to revisit things like the Foo Fighter phenomena too, and perhaps reevaluating this in the context of spiritual encounters. So given the context that aircrew and aircraft were under in that wartime scenario, we could perhaps reevaluate Foo Fighters in the concept of being crisis lights. And indeed, it also follows that engagement with proto-UFOs appears to be reinforced by meditation and prayer. And this is something we see both in the UFO contactee-based religions and also see SETI protocols. It's also claimed that prayer of the opposite intention could also repel. So just as a fairy king who was expelled from Glastonbury Tour vanished by religious rite, so too it seems do Ajin, extraterrestrials and other entities able to be kept at bay by suitable non-physical practice using consciousness. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony Beckett. Thank you very much.